Imagine a moment so powerful, so defining that it shakes the very foundations of global power. A moment when a nation, long under pressure and threat, stands tall and sends a message no one can ignore. Today, we dive deep into the story of Iran's final answer to America, a response that has the whole world asking, is war coming? What you're about to hear isn't just news. It's a lesson in courage, resilience, and the truth behind the headline. Stay with me till the end, because understanding this could change how you see the future, how you see power, and how you see the fight for dignity on the world stage. This is not just a story, this is a reality check. Let's get into it. The tension between the United States and Iran is not a sudden event, but rather a chapter in a long and complicated story that stretches back decades. To truly understand why the situation has escalated to the point where Iran has given what many call its final answer, we must first look deep into the history that laid the foundation for this ongoing conflict. The roots of the U.S.-Iran tensions can be traced back to the 1950s, when Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, was overthrown in a coup orchestrated by the CIA and British intelligence. This event left a lasting scar on Iran's national psyche, fueling deep mistrust toward Western powers, especially America. The U.S. supported the Shah, a monarch whose rule was seen by many Iranians as oppressive and disconnected from the people's aspirations. This support for the Shah further widened the gap between the two nations. Then came the 1979 Islamic Revolution, a turning point that completely transformed Iran's government, society, and its relations with the world. The Shah was overthrown, and the new Islamic Republic emerged with a vision that was both political and religious, emphasizing independence from Western influence and a commitment to certain ideological principles. The hostage crisis at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, where American diplomats were held captive for 444 days, marked a point of no return in the hostility between the two nations. Since then, sanctions, proxy conflicts, and rhetorical confrontations have defined the relationship, with each side seeing the other as a threat to their interests and values. Sanctions have played a critical role in the deterioration of relations. The United States has imposed multiple waves of economic sanctions on Iran, aimed at pressuring its government to halt its nuclear program and curb what it calls Iran's support for terrorism and regional interference. These sanctions have had a devastating impact on Iran's economy, affecting ordinary citizens' lives and causing widespread hardship. Yet these measures have also hardened Iran's resolve, as many Iranians perceive the sanctions as unjust punishment and a violation of their sovereignty. Diplomatic efforts have been made over the years to ease tensions, but they have often been fragile and temporary. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, commonly known as the Iran nuclear deal, was a significant breakthrough that brought together Iran and 6 world powers, including the United States, in an agreement to limit Iran's nuclear capabilities in exchange for sanction relief. However, the U.S. withdrawal from the deal in 2018 under a new administration reignited the flames of conflict. The reimposition of harsh sanctions pushed Iran to resume some of its nuclear activities, increasing fears of nuclear proliferation and bringing the world back to the brink. Throughout this history, both sides have played a part in the escalation. The United States has accused Iran of supporting terrorist groups, destabilizing the Middle East, and developing nuclear weapons under the guise of peaceful energy programs. Iran, on the other hand, has portrayed itself as a victim of Western aggression, defending its right to self-determination and resisting foreign domination. This cycle of accusation and retaliation has created a stalemate, making meaningful dialogue difficult and the risk of miscalculation high. Understanding this background is crucial because it frames why Iran's recent defiant stance is so significant. It is not just a reaction to a single event or sanction, but the culmination of decades of struggle for power, identity, and survival on the international stage. It also explains why any move toward peace requires not just negotiation over nuclear terms or sanctions, but addressing deep-rooted grievances and mutual mistrust that have built up over generations. Without this context, it is easy to misinterpret Iran's actions as mere provocations, when in reality, they are part of a larger story of resistance, pride, and a fight to assert a nation's dignity against overwhelming pressure. Iran's recent response to the relentless pressure from the United States marks a defining moment in this long-standing conflict, revealing a nation determined to stand its ground and refuse submission. This defiance is not a spontaneous reaction, but a carefully measured and resolute declaration of sovereignty and national pride. After years of facing economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and military threats, Iran's leadership has chosen a path that signals their unwillingness to back down, regardless of the consequences. This response sends a message far beyond the immediate issue at hand. It declares to the world that Iran sees itself as a force to be reckoned with, refusing to be intimidated or coerced. What makes this moment so powerful is the clear shift in tone and posture from Iran. In the past, there were moments when Iran appeared open to dialogue, negotiation, and compromise, especially during the initial stages of the nuclear deal. But the recent developments show a change. The leadership, driven by a mix of political calculation and ideological conviction, has taken a firm stand, showing that their patience has limits and their pride is inviolable. This is a nation that remembers its history of foreign interference and has learned to guard its independence fiercely. The final answer Iran has given is more than just a diplomatic statement. It is a declaration of a new chapter where weakness is no longer an option. This defiant stance is rooted deeply in Iran's sense of identity and survival. After years of sanctions that have crippled its economy and impacted the lives of ordinary citizens, many expected Iran to bow to pressure, to concede and retreat. Instead, the response has been one of resilience and resistance. The leadership emphasizes that surrendering to external demands would be a betrayal of the sacrifices made by the people, especially those who have suffered during years of hardship. It is a stance fueled by national pride and the collective memory of past struggles. This posture appeals to a broad base within the country, those who see resistance as a path to dignity, and those who believe that standing firm in the face of adversity is the only way to secure the nation's future. Iran's recent actions are also strategic, designed to send signals not only to America, but to regional and global powers. By refusing to comply with demands they view as unjust, Iran asserts that it will chart its own course and will not be dictated to by foreign powers. This sends a ripple of uncertainty through international relations, challenging the status quo and forcing other countries to reconsider their approach. Iran's leaders understand that strength in negotiation is as much about perception as it is about capability. The message is clear. Iran will not be marginalized or pushed around. This bold stance aims to recalibrate power dynamics, forcing opponents to acknowledge Iran's influence and resolve. And at the same time, this defiance is not without risk. By taking a hard line, Iran increases the chance of escalating tensions that could spiral into conflict. The leadership must carefully weigh its options, balancing the desire to stand firm with the need to avoid catastrophic consequences for the country and its people. This delicate dance is evident in Iran's simultaneous engagement in diplomatic talks Even as it publicly rejects certain demands, it reveals a pragmatic understanding that absolute confrontation may not serve long-term interests, even as national pride demands a strong front. The recent response also resonates on a symbolic level. It taps into a narrative of resistance that has been central to Iran's revolutionary identity since 1979. This narrative frames Iran as a defender of its sovereignty and values against external domination. It strengthens internal cohesion and legitimizes the leadership's decisions in the eyes of many citizens. This is not simply about nuclear programs or sanctions. It is about a country asserting its right to exist and prosper on its own terms. This deep sense of purpose energizes the nation and complicates efforts by external powers to isolate or pressure Iran into submission. In essence, Iran's recent final answer is a testament to a nation that refuses to be broken by external forces. It is a bold declaration of self-respect and determination, one that challenges opponents to recognize Iran not as a target to be subdued, but as a player with agency and strength. This moment carries weight beyond immediate political calculations. It embodies the spirit of a nation that has endured, resisted, and now demands to be heard on its own terms. The possibility of war between Iran and the United States has long been a subject of speculation, fear, and intense geopolitical calculations. When tensions rise, the world watches closely, wondering if diplomacy will hold or if conflict will erupt with devastating consequences. In this latest chapter of confrontation, the question of whether war is truly imminent remains complex, layered with strategic posturing, calculated rhetoric, and underlying uncertainty. Understanding this possibility requires a clear-eyed view of both Iran's and America's motives, capabilities, and the wider regional and global context in which they operate. Iran's position is shaped by a mix of defiance and caution. On one hand, Iran's leadership projects strength and readiness to defend its sovereignty against what it perceives as unjust pressure and threats from the United States. This posture signals to both domestic and international audiences that Iran will not easily concede or submit to demands that undermine its national interests. Iran's military capabilities, including its missile programs, proxy alliances across the Middle East, and asymmetric warfare tactics, provide it with tools to deter or retaliate against any perceived aggression. These assets serve not only as a shield, but also as a warning to those who might consider military options. Iran's resolve is bolstered by a history of resisting foreign intervention, which adds a layer of psychological and symbolic strength to its stance. At the same time, Iran is acutely aware of the immense cost that a direct war with the United States would entail. War would bring destruction, economic hardship, and loss of life, impacting civilians and soldiers alike. The leadership understands that full-scale conflict risks destabilizing the region further and damaging Iran's own long-term goals. This awareness fuels a careful balancing act, standing firm and showing strength while avoiding actions that could trigger a catastrophic military confrontation. Iran often uses strategic ambiguity to keep its options open, engaging in diplomatic negotiations even as it prepares for the possibility of escalation. This dual approach reflects a nuanced understanding that survival and sovereignty depend not only on military readiness, but also on political calculation. From the American perspective, the calculus is equally complex. The United States has historically aimed to limit Iran's influence in the Middle East, prevent the development of nuclear weapons, and protect its regional allies. However, the cost of war is deeply felt within American political and public spheres, where there is significant concern about entering another prolonged conflict in a volatile region. Military action against Iran would involve high risks and unpredictable consequences, including the potential for widespread violence, disruption of global oil supplies, and further destabilization. As a result, while the U.S. continues to maintain a strong military presence and exerts maximum pressure through sanctions and diplomatic isolation, it also seeks to avoid a full-scale war unless it perceives an unavoidable threat. This dynamic of deterrence and brinkmanship creates a tense but controlled environment. Both nations communicate through warnings, shows of force, and public statements that serve to assert resolve without necessarily triggering immediate conflict. This is a game of signals, where each side tries to influence the other's decisions and calculate risks without crossing red lines that could spark war. The existence of back-channel communications and ongoing diplomatic efforts further complicates the picture, showing that despite harsh rhetoric, there is interest in avoiding the worst-case scenario. The role of regional actors and global powers also factors heavily into the possibility of war. Iran's alliances with groups in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, along with the involvement of countries like Russia and China, create a complex web of interests that could either escalate tensions. Regional conflicts often act as proxies for larger power struggles, meaning that a direct Iran-U.S. war would not occur in isolation, but within a broader geopolitical context. This interconnectedness raises the stakes and makes any misstep potentially explosive. Public opinion, both within Iran and the United States, also plays a role. Citizens in both countries are aware of the human and economic toll that war would bring. Pressure from populations weary of conflict can influence leaders' willingness to pursue military action. At the same time, nationalism and pride can push governments to adopt more aggressive postures to demonstrate strength and legitimacy. In summary, the possibility of war between Iran and the U.S. is a real and dangerous shadow over current events, but it is not a foregone conclusion. Both sides understand the catastrophic consequences that such a conflict would entail and are engaged in a delicate balance of power, deterrence, and diplomacy. The truth lies in the tension between readiness and restraint, where each move is carefully weighed, each word scrutinized, and every action taken with the knowledge that the future hangs precariously in the balance. The economic sanctions imposed by the United States on Iran have become one of the most powerful tools of pressure in this ongoing geopolitical struggle. These sanctions, designed to cripple Iran's economy and limit its ability to fund its regional influence and nuclear ambitions, have had far-reaching consequences not only on Iran's government, but also on its people. Understanding the depth and impact of these sanctions reveals a critical dimension of why tensions remain so high and why the situation is so volatile. Sanctions targeting Iran have been comprehensive, affecting key sectors such as oil exports, banking, trade, and technology. Since oil revenue constitutes the backbone of Iran's economy, restrictions on its ability to sell oil internationally have dramatically reduced national income, leading to currency devaluation, inflation, and economic hardship. This economic pressure aims to force Iran back to the negotiating table on terms favorable to the United States and its allies. However, the sanctions do more than just reduce government funds. They also limit Iran's capacity to provide services to its citizens, maintain infrastructure, and invest in development. The resulting economic instability creates social tensions that ripple through everyday life. From the perspective of the United States, sanctions serve multiple strategic purposes. They act as a non-military means of exerting influence, offering a way to contain Iran's regional ambitions without resorting to war. By cutting off financial resources, sanctions are intended to weaken Iran's ability to support proxy groups across the Middle East and to slow down its nuclear program. This approach aligns with broader U.S. objectives of maintaining dominance in the region and protecting its allies such as Israel and Saudi Arabia. Sanctions also serve a symbolic role, signaling to the international community that Iran's actions are unacceptable and that there will be consequences for defiance. However, sanctions also bring significant unintended. While they put pressure on the Iranian government, they often disproportionately affect ordinary citizens who face shortages of medicine, food, and basic necessities. The humanitarian impact of sanctions has been widely criticized by international organizations and human rights advocates. This creates a complex moral dilemma where the tool designed to promote security and peace ends up harming vulnerable populations and potentially fueling anti-American sentiment. The economic hardships may also strengthen hardliners within Iran who use the sanctions as proof of foreign hostility, rallying nationalist support and justifying defiant policies. Moreover, Iran has shown resilience and adaptability in the face of sanctions. The government has sought to develop domestic industries, forge alternative trade partnerships, and find creative ways to bypass restrictions. Iran's relationships with countries like China, Russia, and Turkey have become increasingly important, allowing it to sustain its economy despite American pressure. This resilience complicates U.S. efforts to isolate Iran and underscores the limitations of sanctions as a tool for achieving political goals. It also contributes to a prolonged standoff where neither side gains a decisive advantage. The interplay between sanctions and diplomacy is also crucial. Sanctions are often used as leverage during negotiations, with talks around Iran's nuclear program frequently tied to the easing or tightening of restrictions. This dynamic creates cycles of escalation and de-escalation, with periods of hope followed by renewed tensions. Diplomatic breakthroughs require compromises that are difficult for both sides given domestic political pressures and mistrust. The status of sanctions becomes a central issue, with Iran demanding relief as a condition for compliance, while the U.S. insists on strict verification and limits on nuclear activities. Sanctions also affect global markets and international relations beyond the immediate conflict. Restrictions on Iranian oil influence global energy prices, affecting economies worldwide. Countries and companies caught between complying with U.S. sanctions and pursuing profitable trade with Iran face difficult choices. This creates a broader ripple effect that extends the impact of sanctions far beyond the borders of the two nations involved. In essence, the sanctions on Iran represent a high-stakes game of economic warfare, wielded by the United States as a tool of coercion and containment. They shape the economic realities inside Iran, influence political decisions, and affect lives on the ground. Yet sanctions alone cannot resolve the underlying conflicts or guarantee peace. They are part of a broader strategy that intertwines economic pressure with military posturing and diplomatic engagement. The sanctions reveal the complexity of modern conflict, where battles are fought not only on physical front lines, but also through financial means, psychological resilience, and global alliances. The ongoing challenge lies in finding a path forward that balances pressure with dialogue, hardship with hope, and conflict with the possibility of lasting resolution. The role of regional allies and proxy groups in the ongoing tension between Iran and the United States is a crucial piece of the puzzle that often goes unnoticed by those outside the geopolitical arena. This dynamic adds layers of complexity and danger to the conflict, turning it from a bilateral standoff into a multifaceted confrontation that spans several countries and involves diverse actors. To fully understand why Iran's recent responses to the U.S. are so significant, one must grasp how these alliances and proxies function and what they mean for regional stability and global security. Iran's influence across the Middle East is deeply rooted in its network of allied states, militias, and political groups. These relationships allow Iran to project power far beyond its borders and challenge U.S. interests without engaging in direct military confrontation. From Lebanon's Hezbollah to Iraq's Popular Mobilization Forces, Yemen's Houthi rebels, and various groups in Syria, Iran supports these actors financially, militarily, and politically. These proxy forces act as both a shield and a sword for Iran, providing deterrence against aggression and enabling asymmetric warfare tactics that can disrupt opponents without provoking full-scale war. For the United States, this sprawling network of Iranian influence represents a persistent threat to its strategic goals in the region. The presence of Iranian-backed militias complicates U.S. military operations and puts American personnel and allies at risk. These groups often engage in guerrilla tactics, rocket attacks, and sabotage against U.S. bases, allies like Israel and Saudi Arabia, and infrastructure projects. This indirect form of conflict allows Iran to challenge American dominance without crossing certain red lines that might trigger a massive retaliation. It also provides Iran with plausible deniability, as it can claim it is not directly involved while its proxies carry out hostile acts. The U.S. approach to this challenge has been multifaceted. It involves a combination of sanctions aimed at cutting off funding and supplies to these groups, targeted strikes on key figures and facilities, and diplomatic efforts to isolate Iran politically. However, these measures have had mixed results. While some leaders of proxy groups have been eliminated and financial channels disrupted, the networks remain resilient. Local grievances and ideological commitments fuel continued recruitment and support for these militias. The situation on the ground remains volatile, with flare-ups of violence erupting unpredictably, often drawing international attention and raising fears of broader conflict. Iran, for its part, views its network of allies and proxies as essential to its national security strategy. Encircled by adversaries and facing superior military forces, Iran relies on these proxies to create a buffer zone and to assert its influence in regional politics. This approach also serves ideological and religious purposes, as many of these groups share Shiite identity and a vision aligned with Iran's revolutionary ideals. The proxy strategy enables Iran to maintain a form of asymmetric deterrence, making any attack on Iran itself costly and complicated for its enemies. This proxy warfare also shapes the broader geopolitical landscape of the Middle East. It fuels sectarian divides, contributes to ongoing conflicts such as the Syrian civil war and the Yemen crisis, and complicates peace efforts. Regional powers like Saudi Arabia and Israel view Iran's proxies as existential threats, leading to proxy rivalries and arms building. The international community faces challenges in addressing these conflicts, as direct intervention risks escalation, while inaction allows violence and instability to persist. Moreover, the existence of these proxies influences global perceptions of Iran. To many in the West and among U.S. allies, Iran is seen not just as a nation-state, but as the sponsor of terrorism and unrest. This image justifies harsh policies and limits diplomatic options. On the other hand, Iran portrays itself as a defender of oppressed groups and a bulwark against foreign intervention. This narrative resonates in parts of the region and complicates efforts to isolate Iran. And in this tangled web of alliances and proxy conflicts, the question of war or peace becomes even more precarious. Any escalation involving Iran's proxies can trigger wider confrontations, pulling multiple countries into the fray. At the same time, these proxies provide channels for influence and negotiation, offering potential leverage points for diplomacy. The balance between confrontation and dialogue hinges on managing these relationships carefully. Ultimately, the role of Iran's regional allies and proxies underscores the fact that the conflict is not simply between two nations, but involves a broader struggle for power, ideology, and survival. It is a story of influence fought not only through conventional military means, but through networks of loyalty, faith, and politics. The future of this dynamic will shape not only the fate of Iran and the United States, but the stability of the entire Middle East and the security of the world beyond. And understanding this complexity is key to grasping why every move, every statement, and every response in this conflict carries weight far beyond the immediate headlines. The economic sanctions imposed on Iran by the United States and its allies represent one of the most powerful tools in the ongoing struggle between the two nations. These sanctions are not just simple economic measures. They are strategic weapons designed to pressure Iran into compliance, reshape its policies, and weaken its ability to project power both regionally and globally. Understanding the profound impact of these sanctions on Iran's economy and society reveals why Iran's recent responses carry such weight and why the possibility of war remains a looming shadow. Sanctions targeting Iran have evolved over decades, intensifying particularly after concerns about Iran's nuclear program grew. They cover a wide range of sectors, including oil exports, banking, shipping, and access to international financial systems. Since Iran's economy heavily depends on oil revenues, restrictions on its ability to sell crude oil on the global market have been devastating. These sanctions aim to choke off Iran's primary source of income, thereby reducing the government's capacity to fund its military programs and support allied groups in the region. For ordinary Iranians, the sanctions translate into rising inflation, shortages of essential goods, and a decline in living standards. Imported medicines, food supplies, and everyday products become scarce or unaffordable. Businesses struggle to operate with limited access to international markets, leading to unemployment and economic uncertainty. This economic hardship fuels social discontent and political unrest, putting pressure on Iran's leadership from within. However, despite these challenges, Iran has shown remarkable resilience. The government and private sector have adapted by developing domestic industries, seeking alternative trading partners, and finding creative ways to circumvent sanctions. Countries like China, Russia, and some regional neighbors maintain trade relationships with Iran, helping to mitigate the full impact of sanctions. Iran's ability to survive and even thrive under these conditions sends a message that economic pressure alone may not be sufficient to change its strategic direction. From the perspective of the United States, sanctions are meant to be a non-military way to contain Iran's ambitions without resorting to direct conflict. They are intended to force Iran back to the negotiating table, to halt nuclear development, and to curb its support for proxy groups. The logic is that economic pain will compel political change, yet the sanctions have also hardened Iranian resolve, fostering a siege mentality among its leaders who frame the U.S. as an aggressor trying to undermine their sovereignty and independence. This dynamic creates a dangerous cycle. Sanctions provoke defiance. Defiance invites further sanctions, and the resulting economic strain can push Iran to double down on its nuclear and military programs as a deterrent. The economic warfare thus feeds into the larger security dilemma, where each side's efforts to protect itself increase the other's fears and hostility. Moreover, sanctions impact global markets and geopolitical calculations. Restrictions on Iranian oil supply affect global energy prices, influencing economies far beyond the Middle East. Countries dependent on Iranian energy or trade must navigate complex diplomatic waters to avoid penalties, affecting alliances and international relations. The ripple effects highlight how intertwined the sanctions regime is with global stability. Within Iran, economic hardship also shapes internal politics. Hardliners may use sanctions to justify stricter controls and suppression of dissent, arguing that unity against foreign aggression is paramount. Reformists, meanwhile, face the challenge of advocating for change amid economic crisis and political repression. The sanctions thus contribute to domestic polarization and uncertainty, affecting the country's long-term trajectory. In the context of the current tensions, sanctions are a double-edged sword. While they limit Iran's resources and send a clear signal of international disapproval, they also risk pushing the country toward more aggressive postures as a means of survival and defiance. Iran's recent final answer to America can be seen as a reflection of its unwillingness to bow under economic pressure and its readiness to confront threats directly. Understanding the full impact of economic sanctions is essential to grasping the stakes involved. These are not abstract policy tools. They shape real lives, real choices, and real risks. They are part of the broader struggle for influence and security, where every measure taken by one side is met with countermoves by the other. The future of this economic battle will have profound consequences not only for Iran and the United States, but for the entire region and the global community watching closely. In conclusion, the struggle between Iran and the United States is not just about politics or power. It's about resilience, pride, and the will to stand firm in the face of relentless pressure. The sanctions, the threats, the warnings, they are all part of a complex game where every move shapes the future. Iran's response is a powerful message that it will not be easily broken or intimidated. But this moment demands wisdom from both sides, a choice between conflict and dialogue, destruction and peace. As we watch these events unfold, let us remember the importance of understanding the deeper truths beneath the headlines and the human lives impacted by these decisions. I wish you strength and clarity as you navigate this complicated world, and thank you for taking the time to listen and reflect. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and never stop seeking the truth. Good luck on your journey.